This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
It's Quay Pacific's Talk About Strata on the radio right now. Tony Giventu is Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of BC, otherwise known as CHOA. Fantastic website, CHOA, CHOA.bc.ca. Our guest is Sean Lang, President, Interprovincial Roof Consultants. We're talking about major construction on stratas, and obviously we're looking at roofing as a good focal point with Sean in the room, Tony. But let's just talk about when we're talking major construction issues, whether it's a renovation, a repair, or whatever, we're talking some really big ticket items in a big hurry. So let's go through the procedures, the process that Sean has already begun telling us about, because Sean is a consultant. So you've hired a consultant, you've identified a need. Now where do you go?
Well, and maybe let's back up even just a little bit further.
Okay.
And look at the different types of costs as it relates to, because as you were saying, you've identified that there's a big cost coming up, and the scale of the costs. One of the things we forget about is that people who live in townhouse developments think that it costs less as a common expense for your strata fees when you live in a townhouse. Except for the problem is if you're in an apartment building, all of the apartments are sharing the one roof.
Right, yes.
If you're in a townhouse complex, each of you generally has your own roof.
Good point.
And it's a common expense. And what happens is in townhouse complexes, strata fees generally tend to be lower in townhouse complexes because people are not planning for the replacement of the roofs and other components. And they pay their own utilities. They have some of their own more of their own expenses. And as a result, they put less money into their contingency fund. But their ratio of cost for that roof, for that unit, is probably going to be 2 to 4 times higher than if you live in an apartment building. So one of the things in preparation, the targeted roof is in 2018.
Right.
We're in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some catch-up time now. We can start planning, right? So we've gone out. We've got the money approved. Things we need to think about. We know in 2018 we're going to need a new roof. So we're going to have to get into our next budget some consulting fees so that we can actually hire a consultant to come out and do the inspections and the work for us, right? Consultant's going to come out. They're going to do their job. They're going to identify things like roofing maintenance and construction. They're going to do things like looking at what the long terms are and those types of things. And I think that when you're looking at that the Strata Corporation needs to acknowledge there's going to be some money required, right? They're going to need approvals along the way.
Right.
So in the first annual budget, they get the cost for the consultant to come in. The consultant comes in, gives them a scope of work, and gives them an estimate of what's the real cost of this roof.
Right, and Sean's done a pretty good job of identifying that process, and it's really thorough too, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
The budget figures are usually included in the condition report.
Yeah.
So basically, once they get that report, it tells them the whole story about the roof, and then it tells them how much it should cost to replace it or repair it or whatever.
Right.
Whatever the results.
The numbers are pretty clear by this point, then.
The numbers are now clear at this point. We don't just rely on the number that's been in the depreciation report. We actually get an actual number based on some very close estimates and appraisal.
Yeah, those numbers that we use anyways are based on jobs that we're doing right now that are underway that are of similar nature to the one that we're looking at.
Right, so all the costing is very contemporary.
It's as current as we can get,
Sure.
and it's based on recent projects.
Okay.
Well, it seems a little premature to be doing it a year or two ahead, maybe 3 years ahead. But the benefit is, at this point now, we can start informing our owners of what's coming up. We can look at our contingency funds and we can start saying, we have $100,000 in our budget. We're going to need $400,000.
Yep.
Do we want to start planning for this in the next 3 years? Do we want to start contributing the funds?
Hardly premature then, Tony, to be pragmatic.
It's not premature if we can spread that out over the next
3 years.
If we can spread that out over 36 months, it's a lot easier on our owners, and it's a lot more. And the other benefit is if it's part of our annual budget as a contribution in our reserve fund, it's also a majority vote. It's not a 3/4 vote resolution.
Of course, that's right. Yeah,
and this legislative amendment that we now have is only going to require a majority vote to spend it when we get there. So it's part of our annual meeting.
Right.
We can start to dispense with things like 3/4 votes and the need for special general meetings. So as we're going through this cycle, it's not only about scheduling the work and the contract, but it's scheduling the approval of the funds and the resolutions for the project, so the Strata Council has the authority to go ahead with the project.
Right.
So both of these things kind of happen in tandem. You're working with the consultant to set up the process, and at the same time you're working with the Strata Corporation to get them in the right sequence for funding and approvals.
Right. Let's go back to the phones. 280-0650 with the obligatory 604 up front from Vancouver, and from out of town it's 1-877-280-0650. We are in Port Moody. Next, Ernest, good evening.
Good evening, gentlemen. I've got a question for each of your guests, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
First of all, for Sean, we live in a small strata of 14 units, and it's 15 years old, and we're replacing our roof. And we currently have internal gutters, and what's being recommended is external gutters. Do you have any recommendation in terms of a preference between internal versus external?
No, I don't have a preference. Both can be just as good as the other. It's all in how the internal ones are done. The external ones leave less risk if the installer isn't doing a good job, because basically the water is just dumping over the outside edge into a catcher, which catches it and takes it away. The internal ones are a membrane that's actually installed and incorporated into your shingle system, and that has to be done properly. If it's not done properly, the drains that are welded or bonded into that membrane, depending on the type of membrane, if they're not installed properly by a ticketed journeyman, then you could end up with a lot of problems, and that water that comes in those gutters can then hit structural components which allow the water to run back into the building depending on the design. So the answer is I like them both. It's just that one has to be done very well. The other one doesn't necessarily have to be done so well. The risk is less in that sense.
And a question for Tony, Ernest.
Yes, it's something Tony said earlier about Strata Council presidents making decisions on their own. And our Strata Council president is a very fine woman. However, she recently signed a contract with our landscape company without consulting the Strata Council, and some of us, I'm on our Strata Council, and some of us have some concerns about that contract that she signed, and I'm just wondering, Tony, if we have any recourse.
Well, certainly Strata Council members need to understand that they can be liable for actions that they undertake independently without the authority of the corporation. So if you have a council president who signs a contract for services
Without the approval of council.
Or even we find sometimes people will actually sign for contracts like this, and it isn't even approved in the budget. Right? And they've now bound the Strata Corporation into a contract for landscaping services that aren't even approved in the budget.
Yeah.
Right? The Strata Council members can certainly have some personal liability on these circumstances. But here's one of the problems we have under the legislation. A contractor can rely upon a Strata Council member who is acting on behalf of the Strata Corporation. So the contractor isn't the one who's going to be taking the loss in most circumstances, unless they knowingly entered into this, knowing that it was contrary to everything going on.
Right.
But generally, the contractor can rely upon the Strata Corporation at this point to be providing them with the funds for the services they're providing.
And Ernest, are you looking to void this contract because you're as concerned as you sound?
Well, it's just a number of us have some concerns because our previous contractor had done a good job and had been with us for 10 years, and suddenly there's a shift in contractor, and the cost is much higher, and we don't have any references or anything like that. So there are some concerns. I don't know about voiding it at this point, and as I say, our Strata Council president is a good woman, but she seems to have just gone off, and we're kind of wondering what we should do.
All right, good point.
Well, first off, you should be having a meeting with your Strata Council and the president of the council to figure out what's going on. Ask questions, find out why the decision was made. There may be credible reasons, and there may be a reason why you'd want to do this. It would be like this with any service contract.
Right.
Having a meeting of Strata Council. You might also be having to seek some legal advice on the validity of the contract, whether it was in good faith or not, whether the Strata Corporation has any recourse whatsoever, or whether you are essentially stuck with this contract for the next year until at which time you reapprove it. But the other side of it is, if it's substantially more expensive, it may not be something the Strata is authorized to even spend the money on.
Right.
You may have a landscaping line item that is only $6,000 and somebody signed a $10,000 contract. You've got a bigger problem now.
Right.
And so there are a lot of ways of looking at this, but but we deal with a lot of strata corporations who have council members, whether it's the treasurer, the president, or one council member who thinks he or she knows better than everybody else, that simply marches off and does independent business with absolutely no regard or respect for the strata. And the strata council needs to take control of this. As strata council, you can remove this person as president. They're still going to be a council member,
right,
but make sure that you've basically neutralized their ability to represent the strata. But the other side of it is the owners might want to petition for a general meeting to remove this person off council entirely. You know, being a good person doesn't necessarily mean it gives you the right to abuse the authority that you have as strata owners.
Ernest, is that helpful?
Yes, great program, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's only good because people like you decide to give us a call and make it even more interesting. 604-280-0650. Jump in, why don't you? From out of town, 1-877-280-0650. This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata on AM 650. And we'll be back with more right after this.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Has your Strata